In today's video, I am making an updated, detailed guide for the Form I-130A. In the first part of this video, I will mention some important things you need to keep in mind about this form, and then I will move on to the step-by-step guide on how to complete this form. First and foremost, the Form I-130A is called Supplemental Information for Spouse Beneficiary. Some people are wondering who exactly is the spouse beneficiary, and the spouse beneficiary is the spouse for whom you are petitioning, so the spouse who will be immigrating to the United States. This form must be submitted together with the Form I-130 if you are petitioning for your spouse. If the petitioner is petitioning any other relative, such as their child, their parents, maybe their brother or sister, they do not need to fill out this form. However, if the petitioner is petitioning their spouse, then they will have to include the Form I-130A. There are no exceptions. Because the Form I-130A is an attachment for the Form I-130, it doesn't have its own USCIS page. Instead, you can find it on the USCIS page dedicated to the I-130 form petition for alien relative. If you scroll down on this page, under the Forms and Document Downloads, you will be able to find the Form I-130A right here, which you can download to your computer or fill it out directly in the internet browser. If you are filing your Form I-130 by mail, then you will also need to fill out this form, print it out, and include it with your Form I-130 in the same packet. If, however, you are submitting the Form I-130 online, as you will see on the screen, the Form I-130A also needs to be filled out and uploaded in the evidence section of the online Form I-130. As you can see, there is a specific part of the evidence section where you will need to upload this form. The next very frequently asked question I have is, how does my spouse, for whom I'm petitioning, sign this form if they are living overseas? Well, if you carefully look at the box at the top of the first page of this form, you will see that if the spouse beneficiary resides overseas, they still must complete this form, but they do not need to sign it. The current expiration date for this form is July 31st, 2024. If this is still the version that is available on the USCIS site, then this is the version that you need to use, even if it is past its expiration date. However, before you send off your packet, please double check that USCIS has not yet updated the form to a newer version. And finally, if there are sections of this form which you are unable to fill in on your computer while typing, you can also go back and write in any of that information using a black ink pen. All right, so let's get started. If you're filling out this form by yourself, you will start here where it says start here, part 1. This form is entirely all about the spouse who will be immigrating to the United States. So first, you will need to provide the alien registration number, which is also known as an alien number. If you do not yet have an alien number, you can leave this area blank. If, however, the spouse that is immigrating to the United States has received an A number before, maybe from a previous case, maybe, for example, from an asylum case or something like that, then you can, by all means, include it here. Next, USCIS account number. This is only an account number that people receive if they have ever filed any applications with USCIS online. So again, you can also leave it blank. Next, please provide the full name of the spouse beneficiary. And I do get a question a lot whether or not the spouse beneficiary can type in their married name instead of their maiden name. We're able to change your name on the marriage certificate. Then USCIS allows you to use your married name in your USCIS forms. There have been cases where people have been able to use their married name even if they didn't change it on their marriage certificate yet, because there are some states that do not allow beneficiaries to change their name just on the marriage certificate. And keep in mind that you also want to keep this name consistent with other applications. So whatever name your petitioner wrote in the Form I-130, this is the same name you will write here. The next part of the form asks us to provide physical addresses for the last 5 years, whether inside or outside the United States, and it asks to provide the current address first. Let's say, for example, that our beneficiary is actually in the United States right now and will be adjusting status in the United States. So they're currently living in the United States. Then we will type in their current address here. However, if the spouse beneficiary resides overseas right now or abroad, then you will obviously type in whatever their current address is. At 5A and B, you will provide the dates from which the beneficiary has lived at this address. And because we need to provide information from the past 5 years, then we will continue our address history in the physical address to line. So let's say, for example, that before Jane came to the United States and started living here, she lived overseas at a different address. So, for example, we filled in the physical address to, which was the most recent address before the beneficiary lived at this address. What if we need to provide another address since we haven't yet covered 5 years of address history? In that case, we can scroll all the way down to the last page, which is called the additional information page. And here you can type in the additional addresses from the address history. In this part, you will simply need to reference what part of the application you are referring to. So the address history was asked of us on page 1 in part number 1, and you can leave the item number blank, and simply we can write here physical address 3 and provide the address in which Jane has lived before this address. And thus we have covered the address history from 5 years or even longer. If, however, you need to provide additional physical addresses, you can move on and continue inputting them under items number 4A through 4D. So once we complete the address history section, we can move on to this subsection, which asks for the last physical address outside the United States for more than 1 year, even if it was already listed above. If the most recent address outside of the United States was already listed here under physical address 2 or on the last page in the address history, you will still need to repeat it here. And you will need to provide again the dates of this address on the second page under items 9A to 9B. All right, moving on to the next part. Here we are asked to provide information about the beneficiary's parents. So in 10A through 16, please provide the information about the beneficiary's mother. And this form asks to provide the beneficiary's mother's maiden name. So here you can fill that in. If when filling out this information, for example, you are unable to remember the date of birth of your parents, USCIS asks that you make your best efforts in obtaining that information to make sure that all the information you're typing in the USCIS forms is true. If you really have no way of remembering their date of birth, then after printing this form, you can simply write in unknown in this box. And same applies to parent 2. Here provide the information about the beneficiary's father. And let's say, for example, that the beneficiary's father is no longer living. So in this particular case, in questions that asks about their residence, you can simply write the word deceased. Moving on to part 2. In this part of the form, you need to provide the employment history of the beneficiary for, again, the last 5 years, whether inside or outside the United States. Let's say, for example, that Jane Doe currently is unemployed because, let's say, for example, she arrived on a tourist visa 3 years ago and ended up staying in the United States and marrying a US citizen, but haven't been able to work since. So we can simply write unemployed. If, for example, if the beneficiary is a student but they don't currently work, then you can also write unemployed dash student. If, however, the beneficiary is here, for example, on a student visa, even if it is just working on campus or some kind of internship, CPT, for example, or OPT, something like that, in that case, you still will need to provide the information about that employment here. Obviously, if you're working on a college campus, then your employer would be whatever the address of your college is. Same applies for beneficiaries who are retired. You can also write, for example, unemployed retired. And if you choose to do that, you can also include the date from which you have been unemployed or whatever your current actual position, work, occupation is. In our case, for example, Jane Doe entered the United States on a tourist visa 3 years ago and hasn't worked since. However, now we will need to provide the history of her employment for the past 5 years. And we can say that before coming to the United States, she worked in her home country. And again, don't forget to include the occupation on the next page and the dates from which you have worked here. If you do not have enough room for your 5 years of employment history, you can go ahead and do the same on the last page, the additional information page here. It will be in reference to page 2, part 2 of this application, and here you can write employer 3, for example, and write whatever that third employer was. Moving on, this part 3 asks about employment outside the United States if not shown above. If you have already included the name of that employer, a foreign employer, here in the employment history, then you do not have to repeat it again. And some people choose to also write same as above, for example, or you can simply leave it blank. We can also type in not applicable. If you have never worked outside of the United States, it asks to provide this information in the additional information page. So in that case, we can say that in reference to page 3, part 3, you can write, for example, I have never worked outside the US. You may also provide additional information such as I was a student or I was a stay-at-home mom to explain why you have never worked outside the United States. Again, you do not have to provide this explanation if you have included an employer outside the United States or if you have already included them in your employment history. So this was pretty much it as far as the main portion of the application, but let's cover the rest of the sections. Part 4 asks the spouse beneficiary to read the statements that are made in this form, provide their contact information, and sign this form. If you were the spouse beneficiary and you filled out this form by yourself, select the box 1A, which says that you can read and understand English and you filled out this application by yourself. You may select both box 1 and box 2 if that applies to your situation. Say, for example, you can read and understand English, but you were not the one to fill out this form. You can select box 2 and also provide the name of the person who prepared this form for you. If your petitioner has prepared this form for you, you may type in their name here. And in that case, you will need to provide their information in part 6, which will be the contact information of the person preparing this form. I've seen some examples where people say that if the petitioner filled out this form, they don't have to write themselves as a preparer, but in any case, just to be safe, you can still provide their information as a preparer. You will not be penalized for that. Now, let's talk about the box 1B. If, for example, you are spouse beneficiary and you do not speak English and it was your petitioning spouse that filled out this form for you, then you will select the box 1B that this spouse interpreted the form for you and you gave them answers so they can fill out the form for you. Then you will need to write here that the interpreter named in part 5 read every question and instruction to you in whatever your native language was. So let's say, for example, Jane Doe's petitioning spouse filled out this form for her because Jane Doe does not speak or understand English, and her spouse translated from Russian to English, and the petitioner also prepared this form for her. Then we can select both of these boxes and provide John Doe's information in the interpreter section as well. You can provide John Doe's information as both the interpreter and the preparer. I hope that made sense, but please don't forget that if you filled out the information for your spouse beneficiary as an interpreter or preparer, you will need to fill out the information in parts 5 and 6 and also sign this form. And finally, you will need to provide the spouse beneficiary's contact information. You will be asked to provide the signature of the spouse beneficiary, but again, as we discussed earlier, if the spouse beneficiary resides in another country, then they do not need to sign this form. This brings us to the end of this form. I hope that you found this video useful. I hope that it answered most of the questions that you have. If you have any additional questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I hope to see you guys in my next videos.